Let's talk about a really important time in United States history called the Harlem Renaissance. What does the word Renaissance mean? Well, the word Renaissance literally means rebirth, and it also means a time when new ideas were becoming more popular in the world. These new ideas were all about new ways of thinking, new ideas about how people live and treated each other, and what they thought was important in life. During this time, being creative and expressive in art, music, theater, and writing was also very important. Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City. So when we say the Harlem Renaissance, what are we talking about? Well, we know that Renaissance means new ideas, right? So the Harlem Renaissance is all about new ideas that came out of Harlem, New York. During this time, most of the people who lived in Harlem were African American. The Harlem Renaissance was an important time of African American culture, celebration through music, art, books, and other forms of creative expression. It was a time for African Americans to freely and proudly share their heritage and culture with one another. Before we dive into the Harlem Renaissance, let's talk a little bit about history. In order to understand the Harlem Renaissance and to understand just how important it really is, we need to learn why it came to be. In the early 1900s, an event happened right around the time of World War I. This event was called the Great Migration. We'll come back to the Great Migration in a few minutes. First, let's go even further back in time to the Civil War. Do you know what happened during the Civil War? The Civil War was a conflict between the North United States and the South United States about whether or not they should keep slavery. The North said, no, we should get rid of it, and the South said, yes, we should keep it. Because of this disagreement, the South broke away from the North, causing the Civil War to happen. They fought for 4 years, and the North actually ended up winning, so slavery was no more. After the Civil War ended, there was a time period of about 11 years that we now call Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, the South was rebuilding their society after the war, and the enslaved people were freed. The government was working to give them rights and protections to start brand new lives as free citizens of the country. Then, after 11 years of Reconstruction, Reconstruction stopped. The government had other issues to tend to and basically said, we'll leave you to go about your lives. Everything seems fine now. But when Reconstruction ended, Southerners who were still unhappy about the outcome of the Civil War and the changes to their way of life started making life really dangerous for the African American people who still lived in the South. They started to create horribly unfair laws called Jim Crow laws that were harmful to African American people and kept them from having the same rights as white people. Does this seem fair? No. But this was just one of the many terrible injustices that were done to African Americans in the United States. This unfair treatment is called discrimination and racism. Because of discrimination and racism, it became really dangerous in the South for African Americans to live. So eventually, they started moving to cities in the North where the laws weren't as strict. It was still dangerous even in the North, but it wasn't as bad as it was in the South, and so African Americans decided to move so they could at least try to find jobs and make a better life for their families. As soon as word got around that there were more opportunities in the North, they started leaving the South in huge numbers, which is why it's called the Great Migration. Migration means leaving one place for another place far away. So now we have thousands of African Americans leaving the South and migrating to the North, especially cities like New York, which was one of the biggest cities in the North. Many of these people settled in the neighborhood of Harlem. Many African Americans found that Harlem offered a lot of freedom to be proud of their culture. Remember, before moving to the North, African Americans were not allowed to do very many things in the South because of the strict, unfair laws holding them back. So many African Americans now took advantage of the cultural pride they saw in Harlem, and the Harlem Renaissance really started to take off. Some of them wrote books talking about the struggles of African American people in the South and also the North. Some became brave political leaders in fighting for more protection for all Black people. Others became singers, musicians, actors, playwrights, and wowed audiences with their spectacular performances and talents. Now let's talk about the art of the Harlem Renaissance. The art of the Harlem Renaissance had a lot of rich, vibrant colors and showed the African American way of life in the city. These artists produced art from sculptures, paintings, and even collage. These artists mostly showed the experiences and lives of the African American communities that they lived in. This included both the joys and the struggles. Some of the artwork showed the histories and struggles of the African Americans in the South during the Civil War, and also shows stories of the Great Migration. These artists showed a deep sense of pride and connection to their African heritage, and expressed this connection in their powerful artwork. This time in history and art was like a loud voice for them in a time when the voices of African Americans were so often silenced. It was a time to share their experiences with the entire world, and it is a time that is so important to remember. What's even more important is to keep the ideas of the Harlem Renaissance alive today and always.